Hello and welcome again to webinar number 11. This is webinar 11 of the lockdown period that I and all my fellow country people here in New Zealand are in. You can see the webinar starts at 1:30 Indian Standard Time. I know that a lot of you are watching over there. I hope you're safe there. My family and I have managed to stay safe over the past 3.5 weeks. So hopefully we might have some return to a somewhat more normal life in the weeks to come. But I'm very happy to have been doing these webinars with you, and there are more to come. Today, as you can see, we're going to have another grammar focus. Looking ahead on Tuesday, we're going to start rolling out some reading webinars. But today, one of the last of the 3 grammar sessions, today we're looking at passive voice. So if this was the first time you're watching, or if you can't remember my name, I'm Greg. I've been an English teacher for 15 years. Most of that time was in South Korea, back in New Zealand now, and during that time, I've also been working for GRAID. So the reason we're focusing on grammar at the moment is to do for the IELTS test, obviously. If you look at the band descriptors, it talks about using a wide range of grammatical structures. This will apply to your writing test, especially with passive voice, but it's also going to be useful for your speaking test and to recognize the grammar in the reading, even in the listening to an extent. As you're watching, if you're watching live, please feel free to ask any questions on the GRAID site, on YouTube, and I know most of you watch on the GRAID Facebook page. So send me a message. I have my computer turned on. I can read your messages. If you're watching the replay, please, you can also contact us via the GRAID website, or the Facebook page, or even YouTube. Probably Facebook, I think, is the one that most of you are using, so we will keep checking. We're going to look at another worksheet today. There's another 10 questions. Today, it's not really fill in the blank. You're going to be, well, if you have a pen and paper at home, you can try writing at home. If you need the worksheet, it's on the GRAID website. It should be on Facebook as well, but you don't need it. You can follow the worksheet on the board here. If you have a pen and paper lying around, you might want to try writing your sentences at home, or you can just think of the grammar transformation in your head. So let's start with a very simple explanation of passive voice. So I thought, how can I make this as easy for you to follow at home? And this is how I teach it. When we're looking at passive voice, the best way to think about it is comparing it with the active voice. So 2 things to remember. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence performs the action. Let's have a look at this example in blue. And if you're wondering about the examples, all of them are related to different essays that we covered in the first 7 webinars, which were essays for writing task 2 on the IELTS. So here is one which relates to one of these essays, and it tells us the government spends too much money on the arts, right? So in this case, the government is the subject, and ask yourself this question: who spends too much money? The government spends too much money. So the government performs the action, right? So that's active voice. In passive voice, which is often a feature of academic writing, the subject does not perform the action. It's as simple as that. Well, this is the function anyway. So why does the subject not perform the action? Well, in this case, in this blue sentence, I might want to put the emphasis, the focus on money, right? So obviously money doesn't spend itself, so I need to use the passive voice, because again, in the passive voice, or using the passive voice, the subject does not perform the action. So the subject here, money, is spent on the arts by the government, or too much money is spent on the arts by the government. So again, with our active voice, we're talking about the government spending too much money. In the example of passive voice, we're putting the focus on the money, and we're saying that too much money is spent on the arts by the government. We're going to look at this use of the agent, right? So the agent is signaled with by. In some cases, you don't need the agent, but as we have a look at the worksheet, as we progress, we can talk more about that. So as I've mentioned before, When you study grammar, you should think of two main things. We just have a look at the function. That means why or how we use the grammar. Here is the form, right? So this will score you, this will help with your score for grammatical accuracy, right? So the basic form, and we're going to cover a range of different tenses today. So in some ways, yes, we're focusing on the passive voice, but we're also going to be looking at the different tenses in English and the different aspects, right? So, but the basic form is this: 3 parts: subject, the auxiliary be, right? So it could be am, are, is, was, were, or been, and then the past participle. Now, I've shown you this before, but I'll show you again. In English, we have 3 or 4 verb forms, depending on how you've learnt it. So we have the base verb, the past tense verb, past participle, and a lot of people will teach the 4th one, which is the continuous form. So let's pick an example. Let's go with the word go. So the base form is go, past tense. Now this is where I think so many IELTS candidates are really strong. Often when English is learnt as a second language, you memorize these different forms, especially in formal schooling. So I know a lot of you at home are probably saying went, you know, this is memorized. To me, that's the hard part of English, memorizing all these forms. So then maybe you've already said to yourself, gone. And with the continuous form, it would obviously be going. Now, don't be confused. This is, if we say goes, it's not really one of the forms. All we're doing is we're representing third person singular, right? So the base form though is go. So we're going to be using that third form, the past participle, whether it be gone, studied, what's another one? Spoken, right? So that third form. Let's have a look at an example again, well, the same one from before. Too much money. So here's our subject, money, and the auxiliary be. And remember, the PP, or the past participle, that's the main verb, right? So money is spent, or too much money is spent on the arts. And that's what I mentioned before. By signals the agent. So in passive voice, the agent is the person or the thing who performs the action. So in other words, the government spends the money. But remember, one more time, with passive voice, the subject, in this case money, does not perform the action. So the agent performs the action. So what we're going to do is go through 10 different examples of active voice in the worksheet, and I want you to try and transform them using the passive voice. I can just see a question. Okay, so this is a very good question, and this is exactly what I would like to get in terms of feedback, because this is what you need to know. So one question here. Actually, this is one which I was going to highlight later on the worksheet, because I did actually think about this, because we have a lot of examples which are about spending, right? A lot of IELTS essays relate to spending money on this or other things, this or that. So I'm just going to put government as GBT as an abbreviation. So the question is, why can't we say too much on art is spent? Now, I have an answer for that. And as I mentioned, this is one which I was going to talk about later. So later we'll have a chance to review this as well. It's because we spend money on, right? So this is like a chunk of language, and we don't like to break this up, right? So we're not going to put anything between spend on, well, apart from money, obviously, right? So that's the only exception, right? So the only exception might be money, right? So for example, I spent $100 on new clothes, right? So we could talk about money, possibly time. Time is the other thing we spend, but we didn't spend arts. I hope that makes sense, right? So arts was not spent. What was spent? Money was spent. Obviously, we can also spend time. That's another example of a collocation, right? So now collocations are mentioned on the band descriptors, and I've spoken about them before. These are the natural combinations of words. So we spend money or we spend time. Those are just a couple I can think of. But obviously we don't spend arts. So we don't want to break up this to sound natural. And this is all about sounding natural with these collocations. We want to keep this together, right? So money is spent. So all we're doing there is we're just making it passive. But those three things are still one chunk, right? So spend money on, that's going to be the active form. And when I make it passive, it's going to be money is spent. And I'll make this, just highlight it for you again. See, we have that last part which we need to keep together. On. All right, so we still have the same three things, right? Our three elements are still there, but with the passive voice, we're just shuffling the order, we're changing the order. So I hope that answers your question. And yes, that was one, as I said, that I kind of thought might come up. So you're going to have a chance to see this in action and review it later. Let's move on to question 1. So I'm going to go through this slowly for you because I know some of you at home, you might want to take your time and compose this in writing, right? So there's going to be some uncomfortable silence because I want to give you a chance. If you do want to do the writing at home, I'm going to give you longer, right? So with this worksheet, there's only 10 questions, but you need to rewrite the underlined parts, right? So of the sentence, and you're going to use passive voice. So remember, with active voice, the subject performs the action. So many parents and teachers encourage. Who encourages high school leavers to travel or work for a year? Many parents and teachers, right? So all of these sentences are written in active voice. Your challenge is to transform them to passive voice, right? So I'll give you a go and see if you can do number 1, right? And I'm always going to put the answers up for you, but well, you can tell me if I'm going too fast, if I'm not giving you enough time, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to say, give you a minute perhaps. So just remember, you don't need to write the part which isn't underlined. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, but at this point, just rewrite the underlined parts of the sentence. Okay, now you may have different answers because when you're transforming active to passive, if there are multiple objects, right? So we have subject, verb, object. If there are more than one object, then you might have different ways of transforming it. Here is one way. So these are the things you need to watch out for. We have plural, right? So high school leavers. Now, before we move along, let's have a look at all the different pronouns, subject pronouns. I'll write that out. Because this is a little hint. I know a lot of students struggle with subject verb agreement. And if you don't know what that is, I'll show you. So these are the subject pronouns in English. I, you, we, they, he, she, and it. These are the third person or third thing singular, right? So let's have a look again at the form so you know what's coming next. So now we have our subject, high school leavers, right? Then we need to agree the subject with the correct auxiliary form of be, right? So be is going to come next. Here is our subject, right? So high school leavers becomes our subject. Now, my little hint for you, or this is a strategy that you can use, transform or change the subject. If the subject isn't already a pronoun, change this to a pronoun. So in other words, high school leavers is high school, or are high school leavers I, you, we, they, he, she, or it. I kind of gave it away when I said are, but obviously they, right? And what we're doing is we're agreeing these subject pronouns with be, right? In this case, right, so this is the present tense form, right? This is present tense. Present tense of be, I am, you are, we are, they are. Very good. And I can just do a blanket one here. He, she, it is, right? So little trick that I think is really helpful, especially in your writing. When you're speaking, don't stop to think about this because you'll lose fluency, but it's a nice way of checking your writing. So high school leavers are, right? Let's have a look again at the form. This first one we're going to do slowly, right? So just to reinforce it. Right, so we've got our subject, right? I'll put this in red. Here's our subject. I'm just going to put SUB. There is the be auxiliary. Now we need our past participle. So we're transforming, this is the base verb, right? So encourage, well, just so you know what I'm doing, I'll show you the example from before. Go, went, gone, going. Go, went, gone, going. Encourage, this is a regular verb, so it's going to have ed. Encourage, encouraged, encouraged, encouraging. So we use the third one, the past participle, are encouraged to travel. Now, this is another area where I can see a lot of mistakes. right? So we have an infinitive, right? So we have two verbs, encourage, to travel. We actually have three verbs, or work. You only change the first verb in the infinitive, right? So we're changing this one only. This does not change, right? So the infinitive does not change, the first verb changes. Just think the first verb changes, easier to understand. Okay. High school leavers are encouraged to travel or work for a year. Now, that could be one answer. Some other students may also include parents and teachers. So in this case, when we have passive voice, they would be the agent, right? So it really depends on if you think you need the agent to give the meaning. Sometimes it can be omitted, right? Sometimes we don't need the agent. So it really depends. We could have the agent, right? Agent. So I'm just going to put this in brackets because some of you may have it, some may not. If you do have it, it was easy. You just copy it. By many parents and teachers. Right, so there are two possible answers, right? Again, with or without the agent. Both of those are possible. Now, there is also another way of transforming this into passive voice. And this way uses a word that you're going to hear me say again, no doubt. This is a concept which is really nice to know. If you can do this in your writing on IELTS, I can see you doing well. It's called nominalization. It's a fancy word which means changing a verb into a noun at the start of a sentence or a clause, right? So maybe you can guess what I'm going to do. Here are our two verbs which we're going to nominalize, right? So what we're going to say is traveling, right? So I've changed it into a noun. This is called the gerund form, right? So a lot of people confuse it with the continuous form, but it's not a continuous verb, right? This is the noun form, the gerund. So traveling, there's my British spelling. Some of you may have one L, doesn't matter. And working for a year. Now, I wonder if you had this answer, you could write up the rest of it. But this is where it becomes tricky. Traveling and working. Here are our subject pronouns. This is where you have to be so careful, and this is where so many errors creep in. Before, with the other example, where we had high school leavers, right? High school leavers are traveling and working. We could change that to it, right? Is traveling and working because it's one thing, right? Now, possibly you could make an argument for these being two activities. Is it traveling? Oh, traveling. Oh, sorry, can't be two things because it's or, right? So definitely only is, right? So, okay, great question. So let me finish the rest of this though. Is encouraged. Now again, the agent depends if you want to have it or not. By many parents and teachers Now, you would have seen me do this on the example before. What this means is this sentence is incomplete. And the question I have is, where has before entering university gone? Well, I just didn't write it up. So I hope that didn't confuse you, because we're going to keep it, right? So I'll write it in blue, green. I do know my colors. So before entering, I'm just going to put an abbreviation for university so you can read it, right? So this is an ellipsis, and it just means the sentence is incomplete. So it would just stay, before entering university, would just stay in the same location. If you really wanted to, you could also put that at the start of the sentence. So you could say, in both cases, you could say before entering university, comma, right? Traveling or working for a year is encouraged. And if you want to, you can include the agent by many parents and teachers, right? So we've taken a while just to take our time with the first example, because this is not easy. But if you can demonstrate passive voice, especially in your writing, it's going to show the examiner that you have a wider range of grammar. And as some of you have pointed out, passive voice is more used in written English, right? So, okay. Let's have a look at the second example. Now, again, there are multiple answers. I think just so that we don't spend 2 hours doing this, I'm just going to write one up and I'm going to say the other answers, right? Because let's have a look at the time. Yeah, there are 10 to do. And obviously when I write up the answers, that's what takes most of the time. I'm just going to write up one answer and I will say the other possibilities. But I also want to remind you that if you go to the GRAID website, you can actually practice this as a self-review. But let's have a look at the next one. So now, to the viewer who said, what happened to before entering university, this would stay the same, right? So this would not change location. So your sentence would begin with, most people argue that, right? And then you're just transforming the underlined black part. So when you write this whole sentence, you also begin your passive voice sentence with most people argue that. And then you're going to transform this clause, right? This is actually a relative clause, right? So we did those a couple of webinars ago, but let's not get sidetracked. Let's see if you can transform this from active. Remember, who develops social skills? Children. So children do the action, but I want you to change this. Right? So see what you come up with. Okay, I'm going to put up one answer. If I'm not leaving you enough time, please let me know. But I also realize that some of you will watch this as a replay, so I don't want to have too many long pauses. Hopefully that was enough time. Now, here is one answer. And this answer is, okay, there is another way of transforming this, but let's start with this way. So what we have here, social skills was one object, Now, some of you may have also used kindergarten, but here again, this is one answer. So with this clause, this becomes the subject. Here is our be, right? This is a modal, right? So modal, we've talked about modals before. When we have a modal, we use the base form of be, right? So present modal can, base form of be. And here is our PP, our past participle. So again, go, went, gone, develop, developed, developed, right? So that's one answer. Now, this is why I think this is not easy for a lot of students, because we have things like modals, and a lot of students get confused. What happens to modals when we change from active to passive? But this is why the basic form is still the same. We have a subject, and we have be, and we have PP, right? So actually, I'll change this to green so it's easier to see. Remember, this is a modal, right? So, but the basic elements are there, right? I'm just going to circle that in green so you don't get confused. You can see what's being added, right? So again, I said at the start, this is the basic form, but then we have other variations. In this case, the variation is we have a modal, right? But when we have modals, can, will, may, might, they're followed by the base form. And in this case, we need to use the base form of the be verb, which is be, right? So that's why we say can be. And then again, we still have our past participle, right? So I really hope you can follow that one. Now, I'm going to verbally say another possible answer for number 2. If you do want me to write it up, please tell me, and I can. But just for the purposes of time, I'm going to say the other answer. The other answer is kindergartens, right? So I'll show you kindergartens. Oh, sorry, that's not a possible answer because that would be active voice, right? Yes, there's only one answer here. So somebody was suggesting kindergartens. I don't think that's possible. If I said kindergartens can develop social skills, that's also active voice, right? So that's not a possible answer. Okay, so there's only one answer here for number 2. Let's have a look at number 3. Okay, here it is. So remember, for the student who asked about question 1, this would just stay in the same position. Or if you really wanted to, you could also move this to the front part of the sentence. But for your challenge at home, I want you to transform the underlined part. Now, this is a sentence which is more likely to be spoken. Just in case you're wondering, I would not recommend using contractions in your writing on the IELTS. This is more likely to be spoken English where contractions are used. Anyway, see if you can transform the underlined part. Okay, I can see some other questions that relate to questions which we've just covered. What I'll do, just to keep the flow of the lesson, I'm definitely going to answer any questions which relate to ones that we've just finished, but I'll do that all at the end. So I really appreciate the questions. We'll progress through these ones, and all of the questions which relate to previous ones, previous worksheet questions, then I'll cover those at the end. So here is one answer. Well, actually, there's a couple of possible answers for number 3, and I want to show you both of them and show you which one is better. Now, maybe some of you have you see the difference? Here we have the agent, right? Now, the reason this one is better, right? So we can just review the form, right? So we have subject, and we have the be. And remember, we only change the first verb if it's an infinitive. So there's 2 verbs here. We only change the first one. Here's our PP, right? So this one here is past tense. So we need to use the past tense auxiliary of the be verb, right? So was, were indicates past tense. Now, the reason I do not recommend this sentence is because I don't really think it's necessary. I think if you had this sentence, let's say, because what we've said is they, so they is probably the parents, right? So we've already been speaking about the parents, then we don't need to repeat an object that we already know, right? So I think if you did this one, grammatically it's correct, but most likely we're not going to need that. So this would be the better example, right? A general rule of thumb in English, especially English writing, is try to use fewer words, right? That's the style of English writing. Fewer words is usually better. So yeah, that's a question which is straight away. So yes, it is possible, but let's imagine that we already know we're talking about the parents. And because we've used the pronoun, this means that we already know who we're talking about. In other words, we already know the parents, right? So I think this one is probably better. I hope that answers that. Okay. So number 4. Now, again, just a reminder, these kind of sentences are all from different essays that we've covered in previous webinars. This is one about rising sea levels. So I'll let you read this. And remember, you're only going to transform the underlined part. In this case, this part of the sentence, this clause, would stay in its same location because this is a result, right? So when we have a result, the result needs to stay in the same location. This is a time phrase or a time clause. That could probably go at the start, but in this case, this would stay in the same location. See if you can transform the underlined black part. Now, I'll give you a hint, there's only one possible answer for this. Okay, hopefully this one was an easier one for you, because there's only, in this clause here, so there's another clause. In the first clause, there's only one object, right? And the object are the Pacific Islands. So that's going to come at the start. Now, this is when, well, sorry, it should be low line. Okay, my question to you, what tense are we using here in the active voice? Half flooding, what tense is that? Is it present simple? Is it simple past? Is it present perfect? Or is it present continuous? If you had answered present continuous, well done. But this is where it gets tricky when you're transforming different tenses. So what we do here is we have our be verb, right? So a lot of people make this mistake. We have our subject. All right, so just have to think this is be, right? So are being, right? That's the only way that we can represent continuous in passive voice, right? So, well, think about it this way. This part shows us the tense, right? I'll write it in green so you can see it easily. Think about it this way. This is an easier way to understand it. This part tells us the tense, which is present, and this part tells us that it's continuous. Right? All right, so tense and it's continuous. So are being, right? It's the one which a lot of people make a mistake with. Here is our PP. Now, in this case, I think it's quite natural to use the agent, right? Because we're introducing a new agent, perhaps, or a new noun. So, by rising sea levels. Okay, so there's the answer for number 4. Low-lying Pacific Islands are being flooded by rising sea levels. And again, then we just add the rest of the sentence. I'm not going to write that all up because you've only been asked to transform the underlined part. So this part, which is not underlined, stays in the same location. Okay, I'll give you a chance to read number 5 and see how you could possibly transform that from active to passive voice. I'll erase the board. Oh, one other thing I do want to tell you. When you are in any English test, not necessarily the IELTS test, but let's imagine, you're doing this as some kind of grammar test. Take grammar hints from that are provided to you, right? So this is a big hint, right? So immediate action must be taken, right? So hopefully that gives you a strong hint. So use the grammar cues or the grammar hints which you're provided with in the text if you're doing a specific grammar test like this. Hopefully that, if you're doing the reading and you see something, you might better use it in your writing as well. So if your answer was right, I'm going to put up the rest of the answer shortly, but just to review the form, Here is our subject. Here is our be and be auxiliary. And there is our main verb, the past participle. Again, just like the example with can, here we have a modal. Right? So the present modal is followed by the base form of be, right, which is be. Now, there's a couple of ways you could do this. You might have the agent. You could also omit the agent. It's up to you. It really depends on the rest of the context, right? So, like the example in number 2, it depends on the context, right? So, to prevent copycat crimes. Now, again, the ellipsis, this means the part which is not underlined will stay in the same location, and that would be the rest of the sentence here, okay? So, to be honest, I think you're most likely going to include by authorities, right? But with this worksheet, and this is one limitation of worksheets, you're looking at sentences without any context, right? So we don't really know if we're going to be using this in our writing or speaking without knowing what else came before it. So hopefully that gives you an idea why sometimes I say it could or could be omitted. So that's why I put it in brackets. You might have it or you might not. Let's go on to number 6. So trying to level it up a little bit, give you some longer sentences. For a lack of better expression, don't freak out if you see longer sentences because you're still going to be using the same forms, right? So governments in developing countries have been prioritizing spending on infrastructure. And this again, this is a time phrase. With a time phrase, this could come at the start, right? Or we could just keep it there, right? But your role, I've just tried to reduce your writing. See if you can transform the underlined part. Obviously here, I'm giving you another aspect, another tense. This one here is present perfect continuous. So again, trying to level you up. Spending is not a verb. So if you're looking at this and thinking, oh, it's a continuous verb, that is another example of a gerund, right? So this is the noun form of spend, right? Okay, take some time, see if you can transform this. Okay, now we had a really good question. Before I put the answer up, here is the chance to review one of the questions we had. Okay, so the question was, why can't we save too much money on the arts? And again, it's because we have that chunk, right? We have spend money or time on, right? That's the active form. So when we change it to passive, it is money or time. In this case, it's present, so it is spent. And we have that left over, the preposition, which is part of the same chunk, right? So just a little bit of review from that great question we had before. And this same rule is going to apply to number 6. So with this review up on the board, I'll give you a chance just to read one more time number 6. Now, hopefully you can see what's going to happen here. You're going to take these two, right? Spending on, right? So so this stays together, spending on infrastructure. Now, in this case, government, this is the nominalization, right? Right, so we're not talking about money, we're just making this one into the noun form. Well, it already is in the noun form, but still spending on infrastructure. There's nothing here about too much money or anything though, right? So that's the slight difference. Spending on infrastructure. What's the answer here? Oh, sorry. Spending on, okay, sorry, my mistake. Spending, no, that is right. Spending on infrastructure. Okay, so when it's passive voice, it's going to be represented just with that PP, right? So this one here tells us it's perfect tense, right? So it's happening over a period of time before now. But remember, when it's passive voice, we need to have the be, right? So spending on infrastructure, there's our subject. Right, and there's our PP, right? So this one here just tells us this perfect aspect. So it's been happening over a period of time before now. So that's a really tricky one. So even sometimes I have to think, oh, is that right? Definitely when I made this worksheet up, that's the answer I had. So I'm going to stick with that one. Here's our agent. Now, again, this may be optional, but I think you're most likely going to have that in your sentence. And again, here is an example, just a bit of review as well. Here is nominalization. Right, so remember, nominalization means when we're using a verb, change it into a noun at the start of a clause or the start of a sentence, right? And that would be the rest of our sentence. Let's go on to number 7. Okay, again, if you were to write this up with the transformation of active to passive, this part of the sentence would stay in the same place. So it would be analysts say that, and you've been asked to transform this very long sentence. Now, what I've done here, just as a little bit of variety, in the next 20 years is the time phrase. So I've asked you to rewrite this, right? Now, again, if you did rewrite the whole sentence, you might want to put this at the start. But just to tell you the answer, there's only two places where that would go naturally. It would either go at the start, before the rest of the sentence, or you could just keep it in the same location. I just underline this one as an example of a whole sentence, right? So, possible answers here. Now, will have to be, right? So I've tried to choose a really difficult example which has a modal and it has the infinitive, right? So just to show you what's going on here. This is another example which relates to that question before about spending, right? So this is money, so money is going to be spent. I'll put that up now. So here's our subject. Right? Now here is our auxiliary be. This one here is the PP. Now, have to is an interesting infinitive, right? This one tells us something is a necessity. So we keep it how it is. And then we change the last verb, right? So this is a really tricky one. I've put this up because this is one which I see happen all the time. People make a mistake with this one. We have our modal. Right, so you can use modals with have to, right? When we're using have to, the verb after have to changes to the PP. Right, so I really hope you can remember that one. If this one is too complex for you, to be honest, a tactic which I would recommend is if you're really, really not sure, just avoid certain things in the IELTS. There are many other ways of showing a good range of grammar to the examiner. If you have something like this and you're watching at home, please don't think that you have to use this kind of sentence in the IELTS test, right? So it's just something I wanted to offer as an example on the worksheet so that you know the answer, right? So 400 billion will have to be spent on seawalls. So I think naturally that's going to stay in its location here. In the next 20 years. Right, so remember, this would stay where it is. So analysts say that 400 billion will have to be spent on seawalls in the next 20 years. Another possible answer could be, in the next 20 years, analysts say 400 billion will have to be spent on seawalls. Right, so that just moves to the start of the sentence. If you have another way that you think is correct, please tell me, and we can review that after we finish the worksheet. Let's move on to number 8, though. Now, I've included this one as a little bit of review from the last webinar, which we did on relative clauses. So hopefully some of you can see at home, we have a relative clause. The relative clause here is which spend more on education, right? So which spend more on education. Now, it's important that you recognize that relative clause, which spend more on education, because that has to stay as it is, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to use this as the object, right? So that stays where it is, right? So here's our relative clause, which spend more on education, that stays in the same location. And I'm going to write that up for you. The benefits will be seen again, the agent, you probably will keep it in, but in some cases you might want to get rid of it. Oh, sorry, in this case you absolutely need to keep it because we have our relative clause. So yes, forget about that. You're going to need it in this case because we have the relative clause, which spend more on education. Here's the ellipsis. Now, again, with a time phrase, this could go at the start, or you could just leave it where it is. But I've only asked you just to focus on certain parts of these sentences, right? So just to review that form, hopefully you're getting really bored of me putting up the form all the time. But here we have it again. Subject, there's the auxiliary be. Here is our PP. And you're going to see me grab the green pen, and hopefully you can guess under will, I'm going to write modal, right? So I've tried to use some trickier sentences that include modals, so you can see how we deal with those when we transform using passive. Okay, I can see one more question relating to number 7. We've got 2 more to go, and I've got 2 or 3 questions which I will do as a review after we finish 9 and 10. So some of the harder questions are on this page. Now, I've tried to round it out with some slightly easier ones, I think. And ones which are a bit of review. Are removing. We've dealt with this kind of sentence before. So many schools are removing, right? So active voice, schools are removing. That's your present continuous, right? So here's another example of a relative clause. So there's only one way to do this, right? So we're going to say, here's our object, items, but we need to keep the relative clause in it because this relates to items. So items that are high in fat and sugar. Right? So I just wanted to identify this for you first so that you can see this is going to be our subject. Now, in this case, the green is, we need to keep this because this relative clause this has to go after items because this relative clause relates to items, right? See if you can finish off the rest. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a hint there. Now, if you can remember when we have present continuous here, we're still going to agree, because that's still plural, items are plural, are being, and there's our PP, removed. Here is the optional bit, the agent by many schools. Now this would have to stay at the end of the sentence, right? Because this completes it. This is not a time phrase, right? So just to review, we have our subject. This is an interesting one with a relative clause. Here is our be, which I'm talking about as a review in a second. Here's our PP. Now, if you can remember, this time I'll do it in blue as a contrast. This one tells us the tense. This one tells us it's continuous. So I put that in once more because, again, I thought continuous active voice to continuous passive voice is a common mistake that I see. Finish it off with one that I think you should find easier. Identify the tense in the verb, introduced. Past, simple past or simple present? Which one do you think? So if your answer was simple past, well done, right? We only have one object. When you only have one object, hopefully this should be easy for you now, because that object is going to go at the start, a new physical education program was introduced, right? So specifically, our subject here is a physical education program. Now, hopefully you can remember this, tattoo it somewhere on your body. The basic form is be and then PP, right? So the reason we're using the past tense form of be is because introduced is the past tense. So this tells us the tense, then we have the PP, right? Now, again, when it's a time phrase, you might want to put this at the start, but you could also keep it in the same location. That just shows you that I haven't written up the whole sentence. So some questions to review, some questions about some of the examples from this worksheet. Okay, so the first one is about number 2. Okay, so number 2, most people argue that children can. Now, the question here relates to can or could. Very good question, and there's not a huge difference in meaning. If we use can, what we're really talking about here is ability. Could, absolutely. You could use could. That's probably not the best wording I've used all day. Could is okay in this sentence, but if you use could, it's really a nuance, right? Can refers to the ability, right? So I can speak English, whereas could is the possibility. So in this case, sure, children could, it's possible, they could develop social skills at kindergarten. So absolutely, slightly different meaning, but you'll find that a lot of writers will just use these sort of things interchangeably. Because in this case, ability or possibility, can you really tell the difference in meaning? So not a huge one, but to answer your question, in that sentence, could would be a very valid sentence would be a good sentence. So one more. Okay, this is about question 7, and I'll bring it up. Okay, I see the question. So some really great questions today, and these are the kind of things that I think are going to help you the most. If you're just asking about little parts of the sentence, I can help unlock the meanings. Okay, analysts say that the US government will have to spend over 400 billion. Okay, the question is, why over? That's what it means, right? So, but don't be confused. Not 500 billion, right? So I'll put that up again. Analysts say that the US government will have to spend over 400 billion on seawalls in the next 20 years. So again, this use of the preposition over means more than. So analysts say that the US government will have to spend more than 400 billion, but not 500 billion, right? So you can think about it this way. It's a little bit more than 400 billion, but it's not 500 billion. Otherwise, we would say 500 billion, right? So in fact, I would say, let's imagine that the figure is 474 billion. Make a better example. Let's say the figure is 494 billion. Then I would not say over. Here, this would be nearly 500 billion. So how much is over 400 billion? Could be 410 billion, could be 420 billion, could be 430 billion. Probably not 450 billion, otherwise we would probably just write that down, right? So it's somewhere in that 400 to 430. This is the thing about English, we can't express these exact things. This is not an exact term, right? So it's not 500 billion, it's probably not 450 billion, somewhere a little bit more than 400 billion. I hope that answers that last question. Again, it's not an exact amount. This is why we're using over to represent more than. So, as I mentioned, if you go to the GRAID site, I think it should be live now, but you can start reviewing those 10 passive voice questions. Really heavy grammar today. Thank you for hanging in there. And again, don't think just because you've watched this webinar that your grammar is going to be perfect from now on. I would expect everyone to keep making some mistakes. But those 10 questions you can practice and you'll get the self-check answers. So great way to self-study. On Tuesday, so if you're watching for the first time, these webinars are Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. A lot of the viewers are in India, so I put up Indian time. Here in tiny New Zealand, 5 million or so people. That's 8 p.m. But this Tuesday, actually for the rest of this week, for the next 3 webinars, we're going to be looking at reading. Now, when I do that, I'm going to be using the GRAID site, and I'm going to be live streaming a sample test, some practice reading from the grade site. So you won't see me in front of the whiteboard. You will see me commentating over sample readings on these 3 days using the GRAID website. So there have been requests for reading, so we're finally moving on to reading. That'll be webinar number 12. I really hope these last 3 grammar sessions have been helpful. Again, I've tried to introduce grammar, which is basically going to give you higher scores, right? So using that wide range of grammar, in particular complex sentences, and today, passive voice. Keep practicing hard, but more importantly, stay safe. And I really look forward to seeing you on Tuesday.